Tonight, we're going to be looking at a text from 1 Samuel in chapter 13, verse 14 in particular, as the center point of a couple of things. David is a really important attribute in the history of God's people, the story. He's one of the three kings of Israel, and so we three kings kind of will come into this picture a little bit. But he's also someone who in many ways creates the way in which we think about the idea of leadership. Saul, David, and Solomon are illustrations of success and failure in leadership for us across the board. They form the framework or the balance that we tend to think about when we say, what should a king look like or not look like? They are very much integral or built into the function of what does Jesus need to accomplish in his role. And so that's part of the reason that David now sits at the centerpiece in the middle of this series. Now the text itself, this is 1 Samuel chapter 13 and verse 14 reads, "But now your kingdom shall not continue," looking backward to Saul. "The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be prince over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you." That's a great shift in the story of Israel, and I'm going to use it to include another hallmark. And so if you remember in the backdrop of our early lessons, the three we've already had, I take a moment and I describe the principle of the Hallmark movie where you're looking for that one singular misunderstanding about 2/3 of the way into the story, or the two principal characters who should be together but aren't together, and they bounce off of each other because they misunderstand something. Well, the movie then concludes with that misunderstanding being reconciled. They're reconciled, and that baker marries the lawyer from the big city, or vice versa. And that's how a Hallmark movie always kind of closes out. And you know it, and you expect it, and you're trained for it. And it's part of the reason I think that people enjoy Hallmark movies. It's like they know what's going to happen to a degree. Well, what I do is I'm going to show you a couple things really quickly that also ties in specifically to our lesson tonight. And there are 3 Bible passages from the Old Testament that tie into one Bible passage from the New Testament, and they're really simple. We're going to talk about the idea of a king of kings. And the first king for us to think about is Saul. Now, Saul is the king that everybody wanted. Everyone wanted a king. Saul looks like a king, but he's not the king that we need. Now, note that Saul's big failure is when he takes on more than being king. He tries to offer sacrifices and decide what to do instead of listening to the prophet and instead of listening to God. And then we meet David. David is also a king that we want, but he's not the king that we need. And note for us that David's failure is when he's not doing king things. So he left his role and he let the army go forth into battle, and he stayed home, and his spiritual failure was magnified when he wasn't doing king things. That comes from 2 Samuel chapter 11. And then there's Solomon, right? A great king, wise, powerful. Solomon is also the king we want, but he's not the king that we need. And note for us, Solomon's failure, plural in this case, is when he tries to act like the kings of the other nations. He tries to basically become an Egyptian king, marrying into Egypt, behaving like the gods of those other nations through his foreign wives. But here's the last part of it, and here's where the tie-in. You see, Jesus is not the king that we wanted. If you look at humanity, they didn't want him. All of them forsook him. Look at him on the cross, very few were there. At his trial, the crowd said, "Crucify him." But he is the king that we need. Now, Jesus does that subversion thing of all those failures and becomes more than the king that we want, because he is the king that we need. And I think it's important to kind of catch really quickly that far too often we want our leaders to be defined by worldly wants rather than heavenly needs. And it happens everywhere. Elders, deacons, preachers, presidents, governors, and mayors. We've got to do a better job of submitting to the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords in all of this. Because note this, here's the Bible passage from the New Testament. 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 15. "Which you will display at the proper time, he who is blessed and only sovereign, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords." Now, if you noticed how easy it is to tie together the concept of the King of Kings when you pause and think about those 3 kings, we 3 kings of Israel, David, Saul, Solomon. Now, that's an introduction that helps us understand the concept of a hallmark, where we're going to look at something and see in the halls of the history of Israel, there's a mark that tells us to look forward for Jesus. But I need to also do one more thing for this lesson to have its full impact, and that's to think through a concept that we don't always catch. In the text of the New Testament, you may have noticed something really interesting with how the writers of the New Testament pull passages from the Old Testament. Some of you are educators and work in the realm of public education. And I think probably if you went to a class of those educators and talked about how the New Testament writers work with their sources, you might say they're not doing a great job of accurately citing their sources. It seems like a lot of the stuff that they say isn't what was said. Well, there's actually two reasons why that's the case. The first reason is very often these New Testament citations are coming off of a different manuscript group. A lot of the New Testament citations come from the Septuagint rather than the Hebrew text or the Aramaic text. Or they might even go in the other direction, where a New Testament writer who's now writing in Greek cites from a section of the Hebrew text, translates it himself into Greek, and then it appears in the text. And so that creates a little bit of trouble because translation isn't math, it's art. And you got to remember that. And so going from one language to another always implies the painter's brush with words. But here's the second thing, and this is actually a more important thing. They don't follow the citation rules that you were trained in, whether it was in public school or post-secondary school. None of those rules apply. They don't do verse marks. They don't do verse numbers. Very often, they will take 3 or 4 verses, and by inspiration, I'll use this very technical term, they smoosh them together. That's a very technical term. They'll take part of one verse, part of another verse, another prophet, and they'll just generally say, the prophets say, because they're not being graded on that scale. Now, that's really important because it helps us figure out at times why it seems like Paul is quoting from 2 different parts of a text and putting them together. It's because that's what they did. They very often would do that, and they would refer to it in a very general sense. Now, that's important because this passage here in 1 Samuel that talks about David is part of the backdrop to the teaching of God in the New Testament in the book of Acts and in chapter 13. And so right now is a good time if you're going to get those fingers ready to flip through the Bible, start getting them there because we're going to go back and forth quite a bit. Acts 13 verse 17 though reads like this. The God of his people Israel chose our fathers and made the people great during their stay in the land of Egypt. And with uplifted arm, he led them out of it. And for about 40 years, he put up with them in the wilderness. And after destroying 7 nations in the land of Canaan, he gave them their land as an inheritance. All this took about 450 years. And after that, he gave them judges until Samuel the prophet. Then they asked for a king, and God gave them Saul, the son of Kish, a man of the tribe of Benjamin, for 40 years. And when he had removed him, he raised up David to be their king, of whom he testified and said, I have found in David, the son of Jesse, a man after my own heart, who will do all my will. Of this man's offsprings, God has brought to Israel a Savior, Jesus, as he promised. Now, the emphasized section of this passage that's replicated back in 1 Samuel and is now here in Acts chapter 13 is that statement, I have found in David, the son of Jesse, a man after my own heart, who will do my will. And that's an important principle for us to kind of think through as we begin to walk through all of this text. And so pull those up right now. We've got David as our centerpiece text for us this evening from 1 Samuel chapter 13 and verses 14. And in Paul's preaching, there is a sequence that we need to pay attention because it's trying to help us walk through the story of the Old Testament to see physical Israel, but also to recognize spiritual Israel and see how God works with both of them. And the sequence goes Abraham, and he says our ancestors, Exodus, wilderness, land, judges, kingship, monarchy, David. And when he gets to David, Paul quotes from that verse that we have chosen as our fourth sentence or fourth statement on how David is a man after God's own heart. Then Paul jumps straight from David to Jesus. In the story of what happens forward from Paul's preaching, we recognize like Psalm chapter 2 and verse 7 is a passage that's in the backdrop of our minds, because remember this, Jesus died and was buried and he was raised again to the glorious resurrection. And because of that resurrection, Jesus is the one to whom this concept is being applied. Now here's the picture. I mentioned Psalm chapter 2. Psalm 2 verse 7 says, I will tell of the decree. The Lord said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. See, Jesus is the one who will be the true king, not only over Israel, but over all nations on earth, as the very next verse in Psalm 2 ties together and says, ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage and the ends of the earth your possession. The Messiah Jesus, the risen Son of David, is that Lord of Lords and King of Kings. And back also in the New Testament, in Romans and in 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 8, that reties together that same picture. But pay attention to Romans chapter 1 and verses 2, 3, and 4. Paul writes here, which he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures, concerning his Son, who was descended from David according to the flesh, and was declared to be the Son of God in power according to the Spirit of holiness, by his resurrection from the dead, Jesus Christ our Lord. Very similar to the sequence that's in 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 8. So David then sits at the centerpiece of this, because in the sequence of the covenants that we've read so far, Noah, Abraham, and Moses at Sinai, David really is the next major covenant of the text. The Davidic Covenant occurs back in 2 Samuel chapter 7. It comes on the heel of that awful transition from Saul to David. And in Hebrew, there is a term that's used here, after my own heart, that's well deeper than just emotions and feelings. It's the seat of our decision process. It's our will. And so God is early on telling us that this David, who is central to our story, won't be a special favorite because he's super powered, because God will still discipline David. Rather, it means that David is the ruler who will carry out God's next set of plans. He's after my own will, my own desire, and my own intentions. At that time in Israel's history, instead of Saul or Solomon, David is the most significant one for us to consider right now. Now, I also want to point out something about David that's really important for us to have in our minds before we move through 6 quick steps to help us understand how David tells us more of the story of Israel. I mentioned last night that David is a bit of a mess. And I think it's important for us to understand that David, the person, before he was David the king, is kind of a mess, just like Joseph, the person, was kind of a mess. Because I want you to think about what it would be like for you. And if you're this age, it's probably easier. It's a little more back in time for me. Somewhere between the age of 15 and 19. And all of a sudden, you were treated like the greatest thing your nation had ever seen. That you went from being a shepherd to accolades in the city. You're basically like LeBron James or Kobe Bryant the first year in the NBA, where all kinds of money, all kinds of attention are being thrown at you. Now that's David when he comes back from his conflict with the Philistines. And further, the king of the nation feels slighted by you because you have slain your 10,000s and he has only slain his thousands. Oh, and by the way, at that same impressionable age, you're living with a king who has the difficult relationship with you that you're the only one who can soothe his clearly insane behavior, but he also hates you and tries to kill you regularly. It's no wonder when he runs away to chase after the sword that was a prize from his greatest victory, that he acts like a crazy king when he gets there. because he had a perfect model to learn from living with a crazy king. And so he faked being a crazy king while God is working out the next stages of his life. And there's a lot more to the crazy story of David that we can get into. But right now, that helps us understand more about whom David is. He is actually a lot more like you and me than we might think, even then and later. Because young David and old David still encounter all the spiritual challenges that you and I encounter on a regular basis. And these connections that tie together the story of David's life are then revealed to us in the New Testament on regular trips through the teaching of the apostles. You encounter examples just like 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 11 that remind us that this story is our story, because in 1 Corinthians 10:11 it says, "Now these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages has come." Similar to Romans in chapter 15 and verse 4, where these things were written to tell us of hope. Like, that's what these stories are supposed to do. They're supposed to give us hope in what is God's plan to come. Now, with that, we're going to see and recognize a series of steps that take place through the life and lens of David that tell us about what God is doing to bring about redemption. And the first thing for us to be kind of reminded of is the tabernacle, or eventually will be identified as the temple. Now, the tabernacle is designed to be initially kind of a portable sanctuary. For those of us who have been assembling outside, like I know a lot of you there have been at Manitou Park, outside assemblies have been kind of the thing now for us. And in my particular case, the congregation where I'm at, we meet in our parking lot on the first day of the week. And that also includes our very special guest, the neighborhood donkey. And so Mr. Donkey likes to bray about halfway through my sermon. And so that creates a different context. It's a lively experience. And we recognize it's temporary. It's not permanent, but that's how it is right now. And the tabernacle wasn't permanent. It was temporary. And so tying that together is important, because the people who were using the tabernacle were in transit too. The tabernacle is basically a very large tent or a yurt. If you're familiar with a yurt is, it's like a framed tent. And it was designed to be put up quickly and to put down quickly. And the artwork inside of it was designed to represent, in many ways, the very same relationship that was back in the garden. Remember, I've described this every night, how the earthly side of things, the earth and the ground that produced Adam, whom we know as Adam, is the bottom side, and Eden is a location in the middle, and the heavens were above it, and in that middle space between the earth and the heavens is where God and man existed. Well, the tabernacle is drawn and built in that same way to create a relationship between the dirt and the heavens. By the way, the temple followed the same model. It was decorated in the same way. So this tabernacle, regular outer courtyard, the outer part of the main tent was known as the holy place. The inner room, the most holy place on the inside, was perfectly cubic in shape. It contained that Ark of the Covenant that had the two tablets we talked about last night. This all created a place where God could then dwell within. And so that's an important thing for us to understand, that the tent was the focal point of God's presence. This drove forward the stories that will happen involving both David's preparation for the temple and Solomon's construction of the temple. But it was a focal point of where God could be seen and recognized. And in that setting, here's something really important to kind of pay attention to. All of Israel encompassed that, and all spiritual instruction would very often come through that center point. Even the statements from the priest, the high priest, and Moses as he led Israel would all come through that focal center section. And it ties together the picture of that covenant made with Moses and made with Israel, because they were called out of Egypt, because he was the Lord their God, to head to the promised land. And in particular, here's a section from Exodus 29, verses 42 to 46 in principle. But I want to narrow in just a little bit closer and pay attention to this. In that text, it says, "There I will meet you and speak to you. There also I will meet with the Israelites, and the place will be consecrated to my glory. So I will consecrate the tent of meeting and the altar, and will consecrate Aaron and his sons to serve me as priests. Then I will dwell among the Israelites and be their God. They will know that I am the Lord their God, who brought them out of Egypt, so that I might dwell among them. I am the Lord their God. There in the Old Testament, the tabernacle becomes the key connector point between God and Israel, not the king who will one day appear, but the king who is present with them right now, their Emmanuel, their person of God. And later in the Bible, the New Testament presents Jesus as Emmanuel in John chapter 2 and Ephesians chapter 2. And one more tie-in, I mentioned this when we were looking at Genesis, where Genesis is the beginning of things, and Revelation 21 and 22 might be the re-beginning of things. Well, that's also going to be the return where the whole creation is going to be seen once again in a temple of God, one built by God this time, rather than built by the hands of men. Now, it's important quickly to note a couple things about this tabernacle before we go forward. The priests and their sacrifices were going to be consistently available in there. There's a few offerings that are kind of part of the major story of the text: the burnt offering, the grain offering, the fellowship offering, the sin offering, and the guilt offering. Those are the things that were going to be on the practical level to accomplish four basic principles. One, they're going to offer the ability to seek atonement, whether in worship or in personal life. Those offerings would sometimes be grouped together. Very often they were positive or negative, in the sense of sometimes they were for rejoicing and sometimes they were for sorrow. Cleansing was part of it. The sin offering particularly was one that would do that. And all of that then is presented to us in the tabernacle. But then the story of God moves forward as we pay attention to looking for this King of Kings, the first king of worth for us to pay attention to, as we move into the wilderness. And the wilderness for us is that boring book of Numbers. Here's a pro tip for you. Every time you read Numbers, don't call it Numbers. Call it the wilderness. All of a sudden it changes from a math book to an adventure story, and the entire thing changes. You change the label on the top, you will read it differently. But in the wilderness, we see God working forward to a spiritual relationship with his people. And from the wilderness, we go to the land of Canaan. And the land of Canaan, I've described the conquest very briefly before. I'm going to go back into it right now, because there's something I think is important. When they cross over into the land of Canaan, they do so with great pomp and circumstance, much like a band demarking the beginning of a parade, and everything seems great. But gradually you see the spiritual welfare of Israel get less and less and less. And more their enthusiasm drops. They're less concerned with success and more concerned with, hey, you know what would be great? It'd be great to just kind of park right here and do whatever we want to do. And God had given those great instructions to Israel in Joshua chapter 1. But in the end of the text, you had that very difficult and very complicated conversation where Joshua is perhaps almost with a sarcastic tone turning to the rest of Israel, both Israel by physicality and those who had chosen to join Israel from the other nations, and looking to them and saying, well, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And the evidence shows that, yes, he and his house did, and that brought us Boaz and everybody else, from the Levite to the littlest member, eventually became like the nations around them, gradually becoming worse and worse and losing their spiritual identity as being Israel, until the text takes a turn in the closing refrains of Judges and the opening refrains of the book of Ruth. That question of who was on the Lord's side was narrowed down to just a few. And from the tribes in that time of conflict, there are 3 or 4 principles that are important for us to pay attention to understand why David serves that great role that he one day would. In the Judges, absolute chaos. You have a couple of things of significance. You have disunity. Nobody is working together at times. You see this event takes place. At the beginning of Judges, Israel unites to fight people on the outside. In the middle of Judges, God uses people from the outside to fight Israel on the inside. And at the end of Judges, God's people there are fighting against each other. Israel fights Israel. So there's a great decline because they're not united. They fight disastrously against each other in Judges 4 and 5 and Judges chapter 6. Nor are they loyal to God. Regularly, there is an emphasis on the dominant god of Canaan, Baal or Baal. Very often you see Israel moving into worship and honoring Baal or Baal in the centerpieces of their communities. Some of the very key individuals in the text of Judges that we sometimes praise came from families that had a heritage of worshiping the false gods, even though they had a bloodline to Israel. But then also in that time, you see deliverance. God sends judges, some of them the kind of people we want to be around to accomplish his goals. They are individuals that God raised up, who did special tasks, very often carrying out God's justice, and their actions were enabled by the Spirit. Some of them, in Hebrews chapter 11 and verses 32 and following, show us as being illustrations of faith. By the way, that doesn't mean that those individuals in Hebrews are the ones that we should model our lives off after. The Samson model of finding a wife isn't equivalent to going to the well. If you just want to think about it for a second, the patriarchs went to a well to find a wife. Samson said, she looks good to me, go get her. Two different things. Some of them, to put it in the very politest terms, did some very unsavory things in unsavory ways. But they do help us understand what it means to trust in God and to be obedient, even when things don't make sense. So all of that brings us to the moniker for a song or two, but we're looking at these three kings, we three kings. And they're really important to understand as a trio right now. Samuel is the one who opens the door of this conversation. And when Samuel comes into play for us, he's not king-like in any way because he himself isn't a king, but he appoints a king. And he exercises a life of leadership among the tribes of Israel that's king-like, but not the king, because Saul is that first king. Saul, as the first king, has goals that God is trying to accomplish. He's trying to satisfy the demands of the nation, to be like the nations around them, but they does so in ways that the people are warned about, but don't appreciate. Samuel functions from his youth, though, as an individual who is an outstanding servant of Jehovah. He's a judge in some ways, and we consider him perhaps the last judge of that time frame. He can speak the word of God as a prophet. He performs sacrifices like a priest, though not at the tent in Shiloh where Eli and his sons were the priests. But he was not perfect, and that's an important point to recognize, though he was also, like David, useful. It's important also to recognize the key counterpoint in the text here, and that's the Philistines. The Philistines had risen to power at this point in time. They weren't the primary residents. To a certain degree, they were in part a group that had invaded from the Aegean Sea and settled on the western coastal plain of Israel. Their technology was potentially superior, both in their weapons and their chariots, and they were treating the Hebrews with contempt. They not only beat them in battle, but even temporarily, still their very most holy thing, the Ark of the Covenant. The Israelites then are deeply humiliated and feel their only hope then is we need a king. We've got to be united. And that brings us to King Saul, one of the most tragic figures in the Bible. It's the second half of 1 Samuel is the rise and fall of Saul. And as I've already noted, his big challenge, his big spiritual conflict has nothing to do with him being king and everything to him being not the king and doing things that should have been rightly handled by the prophets and the priests. That folly causes the kingdom to be ripped from him. And the kind of loneliness and despair and paranoia that seems to break him and potentially begins to break the anointed future king of Israel and David. David rises to his role as a king after what is essentially a very long and very nasty civil war, even though David was the anointed king. David rules for 7 years at Hebron in the land of his own tribe, Judah, but then he takes a step that will have great significance for the rest of human history. He captures the small mountain city of Jerusalem from the Jebusite inhabitants and makes it the fortified capital of his kingdom. Strategically, it's a great choice. It's fairly central in the land and can be easily defended. He builds his palace there. It makes it the center of his kingdom, and that eventually all the tribes of Israel will be part of his kingdom. He reigns in Jerusalem for another 33 years. Secure in his capital, he builds a government, defeats many of the surrounding nations, pushing them to pay tribute to him. And above all, he finally decisively defeats the Philistines and gives the people rest from their enemies. And in a biblical sense, at last, from Moses to Joshua, the Israelites control the promised land. And to tie together that promise is an important thing to pay attention to at the close of 2 Samuel in chapter 5. But the Bible's honesty is really clear. David falls into a web of rebellion that includes adultery, deception, and planned murder. In 2 Samuel chapter 11 and 12, the story of David and Bathsheba plays out, and it's awful. There's no good edge to it. There's no way to tinge the corner of it. We're not even quite sure what's going on with Bathsheba in that because the text doesn't tell us. We just know that the pressure for her had to be high. The book of Chronicles records for us how before his death, David provides his son Solomon with plans to build the temple for God in Israel, in Jerusalem. And it also shows the massive wealth that David had already acquired, which brings us to King Solomon. With King Solomon, after a short but bloody period also of a type of war, where pretty much what Solomon does within the first year of his appointment to king is kill off all of his rivals. We forget that while Solomon isn't the king of war that David was, Solomon too had blood on his hands. He settles down to a reign that's long and glorious, but it always has a dark underbelly. Because Solomon, like Saul and like David, engaged in behavior that caused him to stop being the king Israel needed and started to be the king that he wanted to be. He antagonizes the northern tribes who don't like being ruled by the arrogant tribe of Judah alone in the south. He fulfills the worst of Samuel's predictions, imposing taxes and forced labor, the very things he warned Israel about when they appointed a king, further separating the rich and the poor. And worst of all, in spite of building the temple of Yahweh, he endangers the simplicity of Israel's faith by multiple marriages and political alliances, including importing the worship of other gods. In short, kind of like how Samson gradually drops his vow before he goes to captivity, Solomon breaks all three of the restrictions that God placed on the kings of Israel. Because Deuteronomy chapter 7 and verses 14 through 20 say that an Israelite king should not multiply for himself weapons, women, and wealth. Those are the very things that those in power of every other nation around them did and do today. But Deuteronomy 7, written before there was a king in Israel, said the Israelite kings should never do that. And Solomon multiplies all three. Shortly after Solomon's death in about 930 BC, the northern tribes rise up in aggression, and the cracking of the kingdom comes to completion. His son Rehoboam is pushed onto one side, and then you end up with the northern kingdom in distinction from the southern kingdom, and God's people will never be together in the same way they were without God's hand coming into play. That is, that united kingship exercised by Saul, David, and Solomon lasted only about 1 century. The man after God's own heart played his part in his own generation, but his sins and the increasing sins of the people produce one disaster after another. But what about the covenant of David? Because really, that's the reason this particular text is so significant. The primary passage that we're bringing up to our minds in this part of our series. The most important event during this period has to be this covenant. And part of it is recorded for us in 2 Samuel chapter 7 and verse 11. Again, it reads, "From the time that I appointed judges over my people Israel, from the time that I appointed judges over my people Israel, and I will give you rest from your enemies. Moreover, the Lord declares to you that the Lord will make you a house. When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. When he commits iniquity, I will discipline him with the rod of men, with the stripes of the Son of Men. But my steadfast fast love will not depart from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put before you. And your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever." David says, it is declared that he wants to build a house for God. And God had replied that he doesn't need one. His son builds one anyway, the temple. But God is building a house for David of a different kind, a dynasty. He says in sequence a few things of importance. One of his descendants will be king over Israel continuously in the future. David's first son is Solomon that served in that role. And the sons of David, who will be kings over Israel, are regarded then as the sons of God. It doesn't mean they're divine. It just means they have a relationship with God. You remember back in Psalm chapter 2 and verses 7 and 8? That father-son relationship is pictured to us in a very reciprocal way. The father loves the son and the son loves the father, just like the love of God and the obedience of the king work in those same cycle. David's house and David's kingdom will endure forever. It really means in a simple way that the son of David will one day rule over all people for all days. And it's important for us to note, and this comes particularly from Psalm 48. In Psalm 48, it is written this way: "Great is the Lord, and most worthy of praise, in the city of our God, his holy mountain. Beautiful in its loftiness, the joy of the whole earth. Like the heights of Zaphalon is Mount Zion, the city of the great king." And then Psalm 84. "How lovely is your dwelling place, Lord Almighty. My soul yearns, even faints, for the courts of the Lord. My heart and my flesh cry out for the living God." God established in his holy mountain, Zion, for the King of Kings, for the Lord of Lords, a kingdom that shall not be moved. It's important for us then to think through how we respond to that kind of context, because there are two problems that exist in the line of David that are also at times problems for us. The first one is the problem of complacency. People of God are so aware of the promise to David that at times it seems like the people of God don't even really care about God himself, because they know it's the promise is going to come true. Because God would never allow his city and his temple to be destroyed, would he? Very often that's you and me, thinking for surety that God will save us rather than doing the simple task that will ensure our salvation. And secondly, the very obvious problem of failure. From Saul to David to Solomon to every king that followed, both good or ill, they all struggled with their individual commitment to follow after God. David's kingdom has fallen, that is. Just as many other of the kingdoms of earth have fallen away. But the true kingdom of David has come and remains. It's important for us to remember that God's promise is still being kept. The message of Isaiah is still being fulfilled. The righteous Savior that Jeremiah talks about in Jeremiah 23 has been found. And the King of Israel that Micah foretold in Micah 5 came from that little backwater spot in Bethlehem, where all the poor people that nobody wanted to deal with were skirted off to from the heart of Jerusalem, the village from which David himself came. That king is present, That king is here. And I want to tie in again that passage from Psalm chapter 2 and verse 7 as we draw our lesson to a close this evening. The text says, for when Jesus is baptized by John, that is, the text will say and show us that when Jesus is baptized by John the Baptist in Jordan at the beginning of his public work, we're going to see the fulfillment of that passage in Psalm 2 when God's voice from heaven ties the story together. So here's that psalm in Psalm 2 and verse 7 again. I will tell of the decree. The Lord said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. And then in the Gospel of Mark in chapter 1 and verse 11, it reads, and a voice came from heaven. You are my beloved son. With you I am well pleased. Jesus, the son of David, the son of God, is the fulfilled man after God's own heart. Now here's the tie-in. Here's the hallmark. We look at David, we're not looking at David to be the man after God's own heart. We're looking for the Jesus who is his descendant, the anointed who is the descendant of David. That's what we're looking for. And maybe in the future, every time you read that passage, and you may be reading Psalm 2 or Mark 1, you'll think of David, but more so you'll think of Jesus and how he actually is the one whom God saw fulfill his great promises and his great plans.